Properly managing inventory in a single grocery store is difficult, especially if you want to keep your customers happy while minimizing the amount of waste. Doing that at scale with a whole network of grocery stores is largely more difficult. And if you want the epic scale version of the challenge, you try to do that competitively in a country that has the size of a continent. So today it's a pleasure to welcome Richard Lubienski, who has been doing precisely that for a decade, I believe. So we are in Paris. You're joining us from Australia. It's a pleasure to have you. Richard, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be here in Paris with Lokad. And yeah, so my background, I've spent approximately 30 years working in supply chain, in manufacturing, but really the last 20 years or so in retail, and the last 10 in fresh supply chain with supermarket chains in Australia. And I've had the privilege to both run the forecasting replenishment operations, so that means flowing the stock from suppliers to stores, as well as running the programs to develop systems to do that automatically, or as automatically as possible.
The obvious challenge when it comes to fresh food is perishability. I mean, having very high service level is relatively straightforward. You pile super high everything, and obviously the obvious thing is that if it's fresh, it's a highly rotating, easy to predict product. So you can so the obvious solution is just to pile super high with super accurate forecasts, and then everything will go according to plan, and you will have no stock out, and yet everything will rotate just enough so that you have zero waste as well. So was it your experience? Is it the way it's done?
It's not exactly like that. In fact, it's not really like that at all. Obviously, being fresh food, the key differentiator to the ambient groceries in the store is the perishability, and the fact that if you overstock, you waste product, and that is extremely costly. So being right in fresh, or having the right decisions, is almost walking a tightrope, where too much loses you money, literally loses you extraordinary amounts of money, and obviously not having availability is bad for sales and bad for customers in many ways as well. So you also can't be precise about it. So forecasting fresh, it's not all fast moving. It's not all fast moving, normal distributions and so on. There is slow. There are as your merchants will try and maintain an interesting range for the customers, they're always trying new things. There are things that won't sell. There are products that won't sell a carton within its life, unfortunately. But there's also products that will sell 10 or 20 cartons within their life. So you have it all. Yeah, so having the walking this path is definitely a challenge. So flowing the goods from source to customer, keeping it fresh, so really keeping it moving, is the key challenge. And there's a few aspects to that are in my view, absolutely essential to being successful.
And one of the things that is, when I got interested in this topic more than a decade ago, is that the textbook answer to this challenge, with, let's say, a safety stock analysis, entirely ignore the perishability aspect, and in the sense that the textbook, I would say, supply chain approach to those problems of inventory optimization is looking at the problem from the angle of a SKU, where you have like a stock on hand quantity.
Yep.
However, the reality is that if you have 10 units, maybe half of them are expiring today or tomorrow, and while the rest will expire 1 week from now. So that's interesting that I would say the textbook approach, and it seems to me also most mainstream software tooling that are available in the market are entirely, I would say, blind to the factor that the fine-grained detail of the composition of your inventory when it comes to freshness actually matter if you want to be smart about it.
It absolutely matters. It's essential. So I'll expand on that particular point. So typically, your stock on hand in a store is held as one number. In fact, I don't know any off-the-shelf system that holds adds the extra dimension of remaining life. So there are two ways a product can exit from a store once it's there, a fresh product. You can sell it, or you can throw it away. You waste it when it's no longer acceptable to sell to a customer. And you need to give the customer a certain amount of life. And there's also a discounting cycle that can be present as well to accelerate the sales so that someone will buy it, and because it's better than wasting. Now, so that means I want to hold my stock on hand, but I want to hold it with a remaining life associated with it, so that I can predict a wastage that will happen, that will also subtract. Now you have to, you need that because you can't wait for the stock to be zero. So if I've got 10 on hand and that looks fine, but if they all waste to the end of today, I have 0, which typically means I might order it tomorrow or tonight, and it gets to the DC, gets picked, and very typically a day or so to get onto the store or onto shelf. It's a gap for it. It's a full gap for a day. So you need to predict the waste so that you can actually trigger the replenishment while you've still got an apparent stock on hand. And that's a really important aspect for availability. So a human can do it if they're in the store looking at the dates and say, actually, you know what, I will order a carton. But an automated system needs more information.
And that's one of the puzzling aspects. When I got started with Lokad, that was almost a decade and a half ago. I went early on, I think it was 2008, 2009, at the NRF in New York, the National Retail Federation trade show. It's a very large trade show. And at the time, it appeared to me, seeing what was presented at the market, that these classes of problems was essentially entirely solved, and with very advanced techniques that would be able, especially for like super mainstream use cases like food retail distribution, which is like the absolute archetype of retail, and probably one of the largest segment worldwide, all segments being considered, that such a large segment would have received an enormous amount of attention from the major software players, and so this problem would have been perfectly solved 2 decades ago. So what
that was your finding or your expectation?
Yes, that was based on the brochure. At the time, I knew very little. I was very hopeful to be able to do better, but my perception after going to NRF was that they had very advanced and sophisticated techniques, and that were very much, handling all the basics, and such as this one.
Yeah, I think where the rubber hits the road, if you're actually on the business side and you examine why you've got stock outs, and look at day after day and weeks after weeks as we did, why there is a gap, and you can see very clearly if you plot your charts of delivery, sales, waste, and replenishment in the store, all the ups and downs for your stock in the store, it's very, very apparent what's happening. And no, you can't read the brochures. As you know, you can't read the brochures. No, it's not solved. I'm aware of people working on that right now. In fact, how we solved it, in previous companies was probably complicated, and it was a bit of a model. It wasn't precise, but actually nowadays, I know in Australia, Woolworths, for example, this is common knowledge, have QR codes rather than barcodes, and contain an expiration date on that. And you actually can't take an out-of-date product through the self-checkout and buy it. It'll say red light, which actually means that you don't have to model nowadays. You don't necessarily have to model what the life of the stock is, make estimates and so on. You could actually take a fact. I've sold one with an expiration date of the 28th, 27th, because the customer behaviour, I'm sure all of us will put our hand to the back and get a fresher one, unless we know we're eating it today.
And that's very interesting, because if we start having the exact information about the freshness that is being picked by the customers, it gives an extra dimension in terms of modeling, I would say, the willingness to buy, willingness to pay, so that you have the products, the price point, and the freshness, which means that you can start, potentially, when you want to think about doing the right mix of, best price, best products, best freshness, it becomes possible to potentially start tackling the very interesting problem of putting all those things together, because you don't have to guess what people are actually doing in terms of cherry picking,
Correct.
the product that has the biggest lifetime, the biggest amount of days of freshness in it, or on the contrary, if customers are kind of happy because, well, they're just going to consume the products right away, so they don't really mind if it's if they still have 1 week or 10 days worth of product life cycle.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the other end of that question, at the beginning of that question, do you know what product life you're putting into a store? Because typically you'll pick a carton and put it on and not do a transaction in your DC system that records the date. However, I mean, it is possible, but it wouldn't be efficient. You do generally know what pallet a carton has been picked from, or very close to it. What's the pallet that's been in the pick face, and you have the data associated at the pallet level on receiving, either an expiration, best before date, or in terms of loose product, or packed on date. And that's a really good start for solving that problem. And
so we have the angle of actually optimizing, just as we discussed, the stock level in the store, with the freshness being one of the biggest, very specific concern. I mean, of grocery stores. I mean, there are freshness and life cycle issues in other industries, even in aerospace. But obviously, this is much more dominant as a concern as far as grocery stores are concerned. But also, as soon as we start looking at the problem from a network perspective, there are other challenges. And what, in your experience, what are, I would say, the big challenge if you want to do that efficiently? I would say, through the angle of the network. What is the extra gotchas when you start thinking of I am optimizing not one grocery store, but actually a network of grocery stores?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So and I'll talk about Australia. Let's talk about fresh produce for a moment. So within Australia, it is the size of Europe, has about 5 major cities, ranging from 500,000 people to maybe 8 million people. 25 million population in total, at least 1,000 kilometres between each capital city, and not much. There is stuff in between, but not so much. But about 97% of the fresh produce is grown in Australia. Not always in the same location, because being a continent, seasons change and climates change, so that can move around as well. But what it means, we're tied into a domestic supply, and which means a couple of things. When weather is adverse and supply is tight, then you can be short of a product that you'd ideally want and the customers want, but you just can't get it, and it's not practical to import it in the quantities that you would want. The other side of that, so as well as the shortage or the cut scenarios, how I cut back, is the push scenario, where actually I've brought stock into the DC, and I therefore then must put it in stores. I cannot sell it from the distribution centre. Every day it's in the distribution centre, it sort of loses a value, not a book value, but it loses value, and you need to give enough life to stores in order to sell it in a reasonable time. So you have to, on a network basis, you generally have maybe a day lead time to stores, but you may have 2 or 3 or even more days lead time of getting product into a DC. So your DC replenishment decisions have to be done in advance, and you'll have many replenishments into store within the window of potentially one DC replenishment. So what you really need to do is to postpone the decision to the last possible moment of what I've got in my shed, and where should I put it, or should I hold it? And so that is a subject that we, certainly I've worked on with some good colleagues, and come up with a deterministic algorithm to sort through that. So we call it pushes and cuts, and the objective is actually pretty simple. You want to put every carton in a place where it's going to sell, and not in a place where it's going to waste. And on every carton, every day, every decision, that's the objective. So I'd say we had a fair bash at that because. But again, you always move on and learn. And some of this was, quite a few years ago now. You'd rethink how you solve that.
And so typically in, I would say, the large retail networks, they are, at least in Europe, I'm not 100% sure about Australia, but they typically complicates the life of the supply chain folks by being, I would say, very active on the promotional side. And so there are lots of, I would say, of pushes and slowdowns, and obviously we already have, as you were mentioning, a lot of, I would say, of variables that are not properly under control. I mean, obviously customers do whatever they want. If they want to panic about some product, they can. But producers don't have entire control about their harvest. Also, the weather, is what it is. So we already have quite a lot of randomness, on both ends.
Yep.
But on top of that, we have all the promotional activity that is kind of layered on top, and we have to orchestrate the flows. And so, in your experience, what sort of challenge or friction comes with that in this vertical?
Yeah, no, that's good. And there's more than promotions. Clearly, is an obvious one, and price is obviously a key input into demand. But also regular price. So regular price in fresh produce, certainly in Australia, is not a fixed price for the year where I promote off, because the cost price can change every week as well, depending on availability, because our producers will sell in markets as well as to the supermarkets, and that can be an ongoing, non-stop discussion or weekly discussion. Obviously, that changes demand. I mean, other aspects within fresh produce would be the substitutability, so that there's some obvious substitutability, one apple versus another apple, or one mango versus a different variety, but also for the customer event where I want a fruit snack, so it's apple versus a banana versus a punnet of berries, and price absolutely comes into play for a lunchtime fruit snack. So those substitutions, and I say some are more obvious. I think I spoke about Chinese vegetables was one where you've got bok choy, pak choy, something to put in a stir fry, and well, you have to incorporate those into your knowledge and look at them as an aggregated level as well as an individual level, because you can blow a store up just by going a little bit more on each one. But often there's shortages and excesses even within a group like that. So to balance out that level is pretty important.
And so you've been working at Coles for a decade, managing those challenges, and more recently you started a company that has I would say a very appealing name to me, which is All Futures.
Yeah.
And if you could maybe tell us a little bit about the sort of vision that you have into this all future venture, and what you're actually trying to do.
Right. So All Futures. So that's no accident in that name, and partly inspired by reading your vision probably 3 years ago when I first came across you, and found that very inspiring. So All Futures relates to the fact that our forecasts aren't. I worked in a world where we had median forecasts, and we had teams of forecasters moving lines on charts, looking at history and trying to be right. So the All Futures anyone who's sat in that seat moving that line know that that's its best guess. And actually, a more accurate view, it's not that I will sell 700 kilos of bananas in this shop on Saturday. It's a probability curve, is a far better representation of what's going to happen, and that may be the mean. And you know, maybe I've got no chance of, you know, practically no chance of selling zero, although you can do, because you can have a flood, and or the football game can take over the entire car park. So those things are actually real, and on the high end. But that is immediately a far better. It's a far better representation of what your future looks like. So hence all futures. If you really want to work that supply chain for that and across not just one product but all products, then combining that together into one solve, into an optimal solve, is a brilliant challenge, and that is clearly a better foundation to start with. My second thought, by the way, after I first came across this idea, was none of the software I know is going to deal with that concept at all, not just at the forecast level, but then what do you do with it? And I think I wrote to you 3 years ago and said, I now need to take 6 months off and have a really good think about how this is. But what it still excites me, and it's going to excite me for the next decade at least, is that this foundation is is the start of the solution for so many of these issues. And when you can find an idea that can be leveraged so widely, that is really beautiful and uncommon. It's much, you know, it's elegant from an engineering background. It's an elegant start, elegant solution, much better than solving this problem, hoping that you add them all together and you haven't got a monster. So, you know, for example, you know, having that probability curve, and I'll talk about bananas again, it differentiates the value of the first carton of bananas I send to that store and the 100th carton. You know, this one will sell. This one is more than likely going to be carried over and is there for display purposes. High value, lower value. If you add economic drivers over the top of that, you can now compare the value of between products. So the 100th carton of bananas versus the first carton of cucumbers. Well, bananas are more important than cucumbers from a sales point of view, #1 selling SKU in every supermarket in the world. But the 100th one, which isn't going to sell versus the first one, this one is more important. So if I have a truck that can take 100 cartons, the right decision is not put 100 cartons of bananas on. It's probably put maybe 97 and 3 of cucumbers. That's what's going to sell and keep the customer happy. So that's a really powerful way to firstly look at pushes and cuts. It's a natural solution for that, and also as a start into managing constraints, which is the other key feature of your life. I think managing fresh supply chain is it's not so much BAU with no holidays or anything like that. The volume of fresh in particular that points towards events like Christmas, Easter, in particular where you have complete shut, no sales days, is the customer demand spikes in the extreme. You know, maybe three times the normal volume that you're trying to flow through.
And again, with this all future venture, the interesting thing is that you're trying to shake and challenge a bit the status quo. I mean, my perception is that I would say mainstream retail, general retails, is very much rigidified around a supply chain strategy which is divide and conquer, have many demand and supply planners, each person managing, you know, from 100 to a couple of hundreds of products / SKUs, depends exactly how they slice and dice, you know, the SKUs. But fundamentally, it is very intriguing because they have. It seems that this industry has kind of rigidified a setup that is dating from the late 80s, early 90s, almost 3 decades ago, with essentially people who spend their entire career looking at a few hundred lines every single day, revisiting the same spreadsheet, potentially, you know, same web page now, because the system can be online, but fundamentally they are doing pretty much the same than what they were doing with a spreadsheet, even if they have like a web-based app to do that. And what I'm getting at is that it's for me is that what was your perception about the added value of having essentially an army of clerks who are revisiting guesses all year long, each clerk being responsible of their own small scope, and then we have the entire industry that operates with just piling up clerks, armies of clerks, to try to optimize in the end this those network of grocery stores.
Yeah. So I mean, the first thing I'll say is it's pretty obvious, right? The scale of a major national supermarket chain is in terms of tens, hundreds of millions of dollars a day can be in sales, so the desire to be right, to have availability, to satisfy the customer, not be wasted, is intense. And what you can gain and lose, far, despite the fact you can literally have hundreds of people working on this, what you can lose and gain still outweighs that cost. But what it does say is, actually, and I'll say something for the demand planners. If you look at products day in, day out, what their sales are, what last year was, you do learn. You start to understand the subtle drivers that create demand for a product. The second thing it says is your software doesn't work particularly well. But I don't think that's terribly unusual experience for a lot of people who have worked in manufacturing and supply chain for certainly in my lifetime, that actually normally even your textbooks are ahead of your software. I remember 20 years ago when I'm looking at software, I can't do a square root in a calculation. Not sure that was a good idea anyway, but it's because too much computing power. So the world's changed, right? It is time to revisit how those solutions get made. So, I can understand why, but you've got to say there is a better way, and a better way. It's not about being precise, right? It's about having a good aggregated set of decisions and flows. Yeah.
And when you start, looking at this decision from this prioritized perspective, which is also very much the Lokad way of tackling the problem. So it's a bit self-serving as a question, but nevertheless, I still believe that it is very relevant. What do you see as other potential benefits for the network as a whole? So we can really decide. You just gave the example of cherry picking the cartons. The first for the most pressing products, but actually at some point you realize, if you prioritize correctly, that even I would say a low priority product at some point becomes competitive against the nth carton of something that you've already pushed to store. Is there also elements that can be considered when we start looking at the problem from a network perspective? Yeah,
I mean, even as both network but supply chain departments. My experience, they can still be quite siloed into, even within a company, between a team that does forecast and replenishment, i.e. that uses tools to define the task that needs doing, and another group, logistics, that execute the task. One can have a set of KPIs that's about service level and forecast accuracy, whether you like those things or not, but the other one is heavily cost focused. Trucks, sheds, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people can be involved, and we'll have a cost KPI, and their opportunity to cut costs and be efficient, it can only go so far, right? They can do a perfect job of doing it. And this is even more so in the world where you use a third-party logistics company, where literally their job is to do what I'm told, as efficiently and effectively as possible, and so that your supply chain costs can get to this level. Okay, if you bring the task into play, and can reshape that and for example smooth that task across the network, then the opportunity to reduce supply chain cost is huge. And I'll expand on that a little bit. If you took the centre of the store, the ambient grocery, typical supermarket may have 20 to 30,000 SKUs across the whole supermarket. 70% of those will sell less than 1 unit a day. There you go, and replenish less than 1 carton per week on average. Looking at those statistics, I would estimate probably in a flow casting system or a reorder point system, maybe 50% of the volume that you would ship, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of cartons on a daily basis, doesn't have to go on the day that it's triggered. It could be moved earlier. That's not so much of a challenging concept, other than for capacity in stores, but could be delayed tomorrow. Could be delayed a couple of days with little or negligible impact, or an impact that is negligible in comparison to the supply chain cost to actually ship it on peak day in the week. So if you can do that, that opens up a whole business case of opportunities for supply chain cost. And also, nowadays we're seeing a lot of investment in automation, customer fulfillment centres. Customer fulfillment centres less so, because you need to deliver it when the customer wants, but supermarket replenishment, yeah, absolutely. So the expensive assets being invested in could have a longer life or be smaller to deliver the same demand. I think that's an attractive proposition. But you have to bring the two the cost to serve in together with the replenishment decision making. If you bring those together, then the whole supply chain industry has a whole new horizon to go after.
And that's very interesting, because that's typically a case that you outline here, which is joint optimization. So you're optimizing the quality of service versus, I would say, inventory write-off cost in the store, plus the transportation costs that are also part of the picture. So you're doing multiple optimization, and potentially all of that can be enriched further with pricing optimization, controlling exactly the amount of discount for products that are nearing the expiration date. And here, my own experience is that although those elements are fairly obvious when you think about it, and that you want to optimize all of that, the typical problem that companies face is that their own division of labor has already created silos that even prevent people from even looking at this sort of optimization, because the silos define, I would say, strictly isolated areas where the rest do not exist. So people who do the transportation do not see what is happening exactly in the stores. Every single division has its own silo. And so maybe with all futures, how do you see this sort of conduct of change, in those large companies? Because the primary bottleneck that I see is that the organization in place is typically very, very adverse to even consider in the first place this sort of joint optimization, where you take multiple problems that belong to multiple departments, you bring them together and you re-optimize with computers, obviously, across the board to get something that is superior to anything that could be done in isolation for every segment.
Yeah, so I think the concept is more challenging actually for the traditional forecasting replenishment departments than it is for logistics. I think logistics has everything to gain from smoother operation, safer operation when it's smoother, fewer peaks, constraints managed and respected, as opposed to receiving an unconstrained and unprioritized pick list that actually you can't squeeze through at Christmas, or at least they have to push the boundaries, and that's not good. So there is a change. It requires, I think, inspired leadership, frankly, from the top down. Departments of any sort are a bit defensive of their own structures and their own people and their own way of working. And retail's an intensely pressured environment as well. So to start contemplating a complete shake-up of what you do on a day-to-day basis, and it's 7 days a week. You know, it's a tough challenge. It's a tough personal challenge, but you know, it's an opportunity that's well worth going for. The transition states between kind of what you do and your 2B are, I think, as a program manager, something that needs careful management and attention, because it's quite often easy to see, right, here we are today, that's the vision of tomorrow. Actually, how do we get between those two? Because we're not just going to switch the whole, no one's going to switch the whole company over and risk their entire sales. So you will start off at departments and you know, a certain level, and watch it carefully. But the prize is there. You know, the shareholder value is there. The safety aspect is there. The cost of the environment is there. The waste is there. All of the pressures in the right are in the right places, actually, other than well, they all are, and the technology direction is is going in the right way as well.
And so maybe to conclude this interview, where do you see the market going for maybe, you know, the next 5 to 10 years? When I said the market, I mean general, I would say, large food retail network. With regard to what they are doing in terms of optimization, and in a landscape that is becoming even more complex with essentially omni-channel. So they have their stores, but they have more and more, you know, additional channels. Plus all of that in an environment where there is a little bit of inflation with an extra variable of uncertainty to make really sure that it's very, very fuzzy. So where do you see, you know, the market going in this environment?
Well, I think the concept of sort of linear supply chains, where I just go from one tier to the other tier in a straight line to a customer, is already confused, right? You know, you try and add a customer fulfillment center into a supermarket network. Okay, it's servicing online. Is the stock coming from the supplier? Or is it coming from our DC, where it's already lost some life? And all of that is the linear algorithms that are just flowing stuff. It's not going to work, frankly. You know, a different lens on you know, the decisions have to be incorporated. I think economics have to be incorporated. That's a matter of time. You know, I've made a few comments in the past about, you know, using the word optimization, and I did some consulting back in the day, and it was a word I absolutely avoided using, knowing that it wasn't true. Not even close, really. You know, improvement, yes. Optimization, no. You know, I never promised that. But you know, in replenishment and supply chain decision making, if you don't bring in the economics, it's impossible to optimize. What are you optimizing? What's your objective function? It's money. It always is. And if you can bring the subtleties of customer loyalty and so on into that economic equation, then, you know, even better. And these concepts are very big and complex at a supermarket level. But you know, in a smaller level, take a pharmacy that takes one tote of a product from its distribution center every day, and it costs $30 to send it there. If it's got one bottle of shampoo in it, that's not a good decision to send that. We should have wasted or put other product, or filled it up with the best other products, depending on the economics of each product and the chance of selling it. It makes total sense. It's got to be the way. But the industry is slow to change, is slow to adopt. I don't think academia particularly helps. Still not pushing the boundaries of the science, as, you know, so to speak, as opposed to maybe training people as to what they might find if they went to work in supply chain. And that, you know, unfortunately, that's still a reality. So it's going to take some inspired leaders to push that. It'll happen over time. And as more mainstream software companies adopt some of that thinking, then there will be more written, and it'll be more. It'll get in people's minds more. It'll come. How fast, I don't know. Hopefully in my career.
Thank you very much, Richard. So this is it for today. Thank you very much for staying with us, and see you next time.